This is going to be fun, maybe, or maybe not. We're going to continue with an Outworlds trend here. And like I said, Al draws for me occasionally whenever I insult him enough. And Dave Locke is one of my most prolific, well, he was before video contributors. And he does a regular column. He also has this thing he calls a dialogue with two fans. And in the past, he's chatted with Mike Resnick, Stephen Lay, Walt Willis, and Denise Parsley. So who are you going to chat with today, Dave?
Well, I'll tell you, I thought today what we'd do, since dialogues and chats are really more verbal than they, suit print. I don't call these things interviews, mainly because that would be too embarrassing. They're obviously not interviews. I throw a few questions out, we see what happens, and we just play with it from there. But today, I wanted to talk to somebody who's been in fandom at least as long as I have, 25 years. He's been the editor of a top caliber fanzine. Now, this person's been the co-editor of a good, well-known fanzine. This person's been the co-founder and currently is co-chair of a little-known yearly convention. He's been a Worldcon fan guest of honor, and some of you may remember this. He's been a fan award winner. I'm sure some of you will remember those. And the person I'm going to ask up here is the guy who just left, Bill Bowers. I'd like to talk with him. Well, the obvious first question, Bill, was, how do you enjoy running a Corflu so far, and how many more do you plan to bid for?
When's it start?
Huh?
When's it start and when's it end?
Well, how do you like it so far?
Right after this is when mine starts. Then it's Terrell's convention.
Well, wait a minute. Let me pencil this change in here. I'll ask this as the last question. Here's one to kick around. You'll see this is a regular sheet of paper. Now this is kind of phony here because, Bill and I went out to lunch a couple of weeks ago to a Wendy's, and I said, I'd like to ask you this and this and the other thing. And he says, well, why don't you ask me this and this? And I really didn't want to bring up a Wendy's placemat up here. I just thought it just wouldn't be too professional. So I transferred it down on this. I'm sorry. It's almost like cheating. But the first thing Bill said he'd like to talk about, and I'm uncertain why, but you may have noticed in fanzines recently, there's been notice and talk and analysis lately concerning regional differences in conventions. Not good or bad, just differences. Colorful differences, flavorful differences. And Bill has probably been to more conventions than any 30 or 40 other fans that I know. So I thought I'd ask him, and he thought he'd be interested in talking about this. Bill, what's been your experiences concerning regional differerences in conventions?
Okay, a lot of this ties back, strangely enough, to the fact that just before we had that dinner, I received Art Widner's first Genzine, a title that had started before I was born. And he had an article in there by Janice Morningstar, who was a former Midwestern fan. And I just skimmed it, but it seemed interesting. Because over the years, I have found there's definite differences between East Coast, West Coast, and Midwestern conventions. There's a different ambience. I tend to think that the coast cons, both coasts, tend to close up a lot earlier than ours do, maybe. And it just seems to be a different atmosphere. In a lot of ways, it's hard to pin down. Janice also came up with a Southern fandom or Southern group of conventions. And I've been to river cons, which are a strange mix, because they're right on the river. And they're a little different than our other Midwestern conventions, but they're not that much different.
Sort of like a border con, actually, river con. It's a cross between Midwestern and Southern.
Downstream.
Yep.
But I went, about 10 years ago, went to one KublaCon. And I found it strange that on Saturday night, I wandered the 6 floors of the hotel and did not find one open party. I was told later that all parties, all you had to do was knock and go in, but it was just tradition to keep the door closed. Well, I'm not the type that will knock on a closed door, so I went back to the con suite and really didn't enjoy that convention. I can find enjoyment in East Coast and West Coast conventions, but they're just slightly different.
I find that Southern conventions have an interesting flavor to them. For example, I've never seen a convention anywhere that has a programmed hearts tournament. West Coast conventions, what I've noticed is they've got a combination of closed-door parties and open-door parties. They've got a mix of them. And they've got a lot of programming, and the Midwest style is basically a lack of program with a lot of open parties. And any closed parties are really only 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 people going off together, and they happen to be passing by one or another's room, and let's go in here and start a party. But do you feel there's any difference that is natural to the convention itself, or do you think...
I don't know. MidwestCon, 1949, before even I was here, Cincinnati bid for it. People living in Cincinnati bid for it, and WorldCon. And that was 1949. And we had people living in Cincinnati haven't bid for another WorldCon since. We have MidwestCon, the original RelaxCon. It's had its ups and downs. Basically, it's a convention with no programming, a banquet, and for the last 15 or 20 years, Bob Tucker is MC, and the rest is just party. And the thing is, I find it very enjoyable. I found it enjoyable before I moved to Cincinnati. But it's not the type of convention that somebody coming in cold who was as shy as I was would have been comfortable with. My first convention, as yours, or is this another question, was a WorldCon. And I got thrown in. I was up for 3 days solid with no sleep. It was thrilling. All these pros, all these people I'd read, I found out they got drunk just like everybody else. And it was wonderful. But there were enough people around that eventually, just rubbing against people, I started meeting people.
Well, you know, Bill, having been in fandom the same period of time you have, and I don't think we met until 1975, but until then we'd traded fanzines, we'd written, we'd seen each other here and there. If I had to, this is one I came up with.
Oh, do I know about this?
No, probably not. If I had to arbitrarily name the various fan stages of you as I've observed you through the years, 2.5 decades.
You had to keep mentioning that, don't you?
I kept a list, yeah. I'd subdivide your fan history this way, based on what I've seen of you. Number 1 would be Bill and fanzine fandom. That you were very heavily into that in the beginning. That seemed to be the bulk of what you were into. Number 2, I'd call Bill and convention fandom. There's a period of time when you basically left fanzines and attended conventions every weekend. 3 would be Bill stands with 1 foot in each. And today we're at a position where I'd call it Bill and videotaping fandom and also in debt. Does this strike you as a valid, arbitrary depiction?
Valid and arbitrary, yes. And the indebtedness is not new, it just escalates occasionally. Like when I go to Sears with you.
Well, you know, before Bill moved, he's got a real apartment now. He used to live in a place that I've never seen anybody with 15 electrical appliances plugged into one outlet before. I hated to go over there. I always felt the west wall was going to blow out, you know, and we'd all just kind of roll right out of his building. But he's got a real apartment now. He's only got 15 or 20 extension strips, you know, to plug all his electronic gear into. I'm uncertain how Bill finds time for anything, since I know he tapes at least, 20 or 30 movies a day and watches maybe 10 of them. You're really taking off on videotaping, aren't you, Bill?
I think videotaping it hasn't gone its course. It's definitely, well, in the last couple of weeks, been moderated. I have to go back sometime next week and watch Hill Street and LA Law and all that stuff from last week. But I definitely go through cycles, in fandom, out of fandom. I find something I like, I go after it as best I can with full speed ahead.
A lot of the females in this audience have confirmed that. We'll grant that point.
All right, you want to take a poll later? Or what?
Well, on that, here's something that I'd like to embarrass you with. I really did read those Outworlds that you kept sending to me, Bill.
Sure, was it a Zenith?
No, this was in an Outworlds, I think. You published it at any rate.
I said this.
You said this. You have written that you think of women as members of a totally alien race. Now, there are probably at least 14 interpretations you could use to clarify that, and I'd just like to know which one are you going to use to talk your way out of this?
Well, I'm not a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. I find most people to be totally alien. It's simply that women are more fascinating aliens than males do.
Number 13. I thought you'd try that one. Well, you know, just to carry that further, I've got an actual quote here. That was just a paraphrase. Bill? You know, this was several years ago, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. You stated that you thought, quote, 50% of the women in fandom are bisexual, end quote. What's your speculation on that today, Bill?
Well, first off, I never did manage to get to know 50% of the women in fandom. Secondly, I've given up trying. At that time in my lifestyle, the people I knew, it seemed to be a valid observation.
Well, today with AIDS, I think the percentage is 0. Most people seem to be jumping back in the closet again these days, aren't they?
They seem to be.
Okay. All right. You know, I've known you fairly closely since I moved out here to Cincinnati, and been certainly very aware of you in the previous years. And I got the impression that you've had a basic change in attitude on one thing. Just wanted to bounce this off of you, see if you think this has any validity. I can remember your old Outworlds articles, where your editorials, where each issue you would say what your glorious new policy was going to be for the coming issue. And then in the next issue, you would say, well, the one I announced before, I was going to do that, but I changed my mind, and here's what I've got. But my glorious new policy for the next issue is, and you'd go on from there. But I get the impression that tenure on the planet here has changed you from a goal orientation to a process orientation. Or, put that another way, you now appear happier with what you do instead of relegating your happiness to the future. Is there any truth to this observation, or am I just confusing shit with Shinola here?
Part of it's getting older, getting tired, getting more blasé about a lot of things. I still have the interest. I learned to control them. I thought about this question after our very lengthy and strenuous rehearsal this last Saturday.
You wrote on your Wendy's placemat too?
Right.
Okay.
But I really thought of this Thursday when I was typing the editorial of the latest Outworlds, which you haven't seen yet. And I got to the bottom of the page and I started this, what I was going to do next issue. And I said, no way am I going to say that anymore, because who knows what I'm going to do next issue. I do the fanzines for me. I mean, and if other people enjoy them, that's nice, but it's not essential. It used to be essential. I think there are two different styles of fanzines. I don't think either one's better or worse than the other, but you either do something for the audience and draw the audience, a specific target audience, or you do something for yourself and gather around an audience, whether that's yourself or 100, by doing simply what you do. And it's a lot more fun and it's a lot more comfortable.
You seem to be having a lot more fun with it lately.
Got some new toys. I want to go home and take one out of the box.
New toys. That's true. Well, you know, you mentioned that I forget the number you used, but you had to put out one more issue of Outworlds because you wanted to number this one
50.
Your 150th or something
50th.
like that. 50th. And in the back row where I was sitting, everybody was turning to one another saying, I don't recall getting that.
You weren't here last night.
You published it last night. Okay, well.
I collated part of it.
Okay. Well, we've talked about this for 7 years
That's
now.
why this is so well rehearsed.
I understand. Well, everybody can see how well rehearsed this is. There's something we've talked about for a number of years, and I really have to put this to you right now. When are we going to pool our talents and do the perfect subscription fanzine? Every time we get together to eat lunch, we talk about putting out the perfect subscription fanzine. I've got one fear about this, that we might do serious damage to the reputation of science fiction, but, you know, more than we're doing right now, that is, you know. But I wanted to know, when are we going to do this?
Well, funny thing, when you asked me that before, I didn't have an answer. Now I do.
Well, you've had time to think about it.
Well, we've both had time to think about it, and within the next couple of weeks, when we both get our word processors hooked up and get modems, and become the Jerry Pournell and Larry Niven of our set, we can do it over the phone, and I don't have to drive 20 miles to do it.
Bill told me he doesn't want my next article on paper. He wants me to hand him a disc so that he could edit it directly on screen. But the one thing that bothers me about this dialogue most is that I'm doing an interview. No, I'm not doing an interview. I promised I wouldn't do that. I'm doing a chat with the person who has the ultimate editorial control on this.
That's right.
That's not too wise, is it?
That's okay. You get to
I'm going to skip the
transcribe
next question then, Bill, in that case. Just because supposedly in fandom we do have some kind of tenuous, or at least orbiting interest around science fiction, I have to throw in at least one science fiction question, Bill. There's no question that your fondness for science fiction is evident in many ways. I know you loan me at least one science fiction book a month, so you at least do that. But in what ways has your regard for it mellowed over the years subsequent to your initial enthusiasm for it?
It mellowed simply because doing, reading, buying, collecting science fiction, I did the same way I do everything else, to excess. As you've known, having had to help me move twice. But this is the first time in 10 years I've got all my books up. And there's some books there that look interesting. I'll probably start reading again.
When was the last time you read science fiction?
I didn't read today's Inquirer.
Okay, let me ask you this. Let's step outside of reality for a moment. This is presuming this is what we consider reality. And let's engage in a little harmless world building, or at least world reconstruction. If you were a consultant assigned the task of formulating 3 suggestions for the improvement of fandom as you know it and are into it, or at least portions of fandom, what would your recommendations be?
What did I say last time?
You said, damned if I know, and I thought, well, you got a week.
I find fandom, well, it was something when I was doing an editorial before I did an issue and didn't write an editorial for this one. Fandom, without sounding terribly trite or anything, the reason I'm here after 25 plus years is there is something of worth to it. And I have this handbag that I got from Eric Lindsay in Australia. And I carried around conventions, carry fanzines, cigarettes, whatever. And at Atlanta, Worldcon, 5,000-6,000 people. We're on the 10th floor, I think, of one of the hotels, waiting for a room party, sitting in the lobby area. And eventually the party opened, and I went to the party, and like 10 minutes later I realized, shit, I left my bag out there. And it had my credit cards and stuff. And this is 5,000 people plus, wandering around this hotel, my bag sitting out there. And I panicked. I didn't have the number to call the silly credit card people. Eventually I went down to the desk. The head bellhop said, one of your people turned this in. I don't think that would happen too many other places. And when I was doing this convention, a lot of people have helped, really. And I couldn't have done it otherwise. And I've had people send in supporting memberships, not expecting anything in return. I had Don Finch. Now, Don Finch, I've met very few times over the years. But one of the first fanzines I got was a fanzine called Half Fanthal, which I remember very fondly. Don Finch sent me a supporting membership, sent me money for a T-shirt, and he sent me like $38 extra, saying that when he got into fandom, somebody told him that if you can't afford to eat, somebody will feed you. But when you can, share the wealth. And to me, that's what fandom is and why I'm sticking around.
We know Don Fitch. He's currently living in West Covina, California, yes. I believe. Don was in fanzine fandom back in the 60s, and I think he dropped out about 1970. And Don was a member of the Petards, which is the other group in Los Angeles. And Don would still attend Petard meetings and he'd attend Lossless meetings, but he wasn't writing anymore. And I remember one time I was holding the term is hoisting, a Petard meeting in L.A., and Don got mixed up, and he showed up the night after the Petard meeting with a 6-pack of beer And he looked in and saw the living room was empty, and he became very embarrassed, and I couldn't talk him into coming in. And about 6 months later, I held another petard meeting, and Don screwed up again, and he came the night after the petard meeting, showing up with a six-pack. And I managed to drag him inside, and we drank the six-pack and about half the other things that I had there, and started talking about fanzines, and I loaned him about 50 of them. And Don got back in. He started writing again, and he's still writing today.
He's not getting that much anymore, so if anybody, I don't have his address here. Yes, I do, actually. If any of you publish fanzines and really want to send them to a nice guy, you might not get a response. Catch me later, I'll give you Don's address.
Very literate fellow. Very good fellow. Final question, how do you like Corflu so far, Bill?
Reruns already? Yeah, I'm having fun.
I'm having a good time, too. It's
Okay.
been nice talking with
Thanks,
you. Thank
Mr.
you
Day.
very much.